In this video, we are going to focus on properties of real numbers. Now, we're going to be going through a lot of different terms, and many of these properties are probably going to seem very straightforward, but it's important to understand these because we can use them in the future as possible shortcuts. So, let's start with the properties of real numbers, such as identities and inverses, and go from there. For our first two properties, let's look at the additive identity property and the additive inverse property. Since we are dealing with additive properties, these are properties involving addition. For the additive identity property, what we are told is that any number, such as 5, plus 0 is 5. So, like I said, these properties may seem very straightforward, and why are we wasting time on them? But they could be used for shortcuts in the future, especially some of the other ones I'll show you later on. So the identity property says if you add 0 to any number, you are going to get that same number you started with. You didn't change the number's identity. You started off as 5, you added nothing to it, so you ended up with 5. Now, the additive inverse is a little different. This is still addition, but the additive inverse says that any number plus its opposite is 0. So if I have 3 and I add to it -3, I'm going to get 0. And it works with pretty much, well, I shouldn't say pretty much, it works with any real number. You add its opposite, you get 0. So those are our first two properties here, the additive identity, where anything plus 0 gives you the original number, and the additive inverse property, where anything plus its opposite is 0. Now let's look at the multiplication properties. Alright, for our next two properties of real numbers, we have the multiplicative identity property and the multiplicative inverse property. This time we have the word multiplicative, which you can assume means multiplication is involved. And we have the same identity and inverse terms here. But these are a little different for this property, because it's not like addition. Addition for the identity said if I add 0, I don't change the number. Well, for multiplication, if I multiply by 0, that's going to change the number. That's going to give me 0. And the multiplicative identity property is all about starting with something and not changing it. So for the multiplicative identity property, it's not a number times 0, it's some number times 1. And that is going to equal the original number that you started off with. 5 times 1 equals 5. So what we are saying here is the product of any number and 1 is your original number. The multiplicative inverse property, we are going to be dealing with not the opposite numbers this time, because last time it was to get to 0. With the multiplicative inverse, we want to get to 1. So if I have, let's say, 3, I'm going to need to multiply 3 by its reciprocal, 1 over 3. And that's going to give me 1 as my answer. Now, what if I have a more complicated number here for the multiplicative inverse? What if I have, let's say 4/5? I can still multiply this by the reciprocal, which is 5/4. I just flipped the fraction. That gives me 20 over 20, which is 1. So there we have it. There is the multiplicative identity and the multiplicative inverse properties to go along with the additive inverse and the additive identity. Okay, let's take a look at the next stuff. The next property we're going to talk about is the closure property. And what the closure property is talking about is how if you add any two numbers or multiply any two numbers, and this is the important part, they need to be real numbers. So if you're not sure what I mean by real numbers, I recommend going back and looking at the previous video on sets of numbers. But if you are adding two real numbers, according to the closure property, your sum will also be a real number. And if you are multiplying two real numbers together, your product will be, sorry, that's not 5, that's 6, I wasn't thinking there. Your product will be a real number as well. So that's really all the closure property is saying. If you look at your original numbers, as long as these fit the definition of a real number, or are in the real set, your sum or product will be a real number. You can have integers. So let's go with negative 11. And if I add to it a rational number of 5.5, both of these, even though this is an integer and this is a rational number, they both still fit under the umbrella of real numbers. So we can add those together and we are going to have an answer of negative 5.5. Okay, so that's the closure property. Now let's talk about the commutative property. Simply put, the commutative property says if you are adding two numbers together, you can change their order and you're going to get the exact same answer. So 4 plus 5 is going to give you the same thing as 5 plus 4. I used to think of this as the numbers are commuting. They're moving around. When you commute, you go from one place to another. So the 4 and the 5 move around. They swap positions. Now this property works with addition, and it also works with multiplication. So if I have 3 times 4, that's going to get me the exact same answer as 4 times 3. If you have addition, this is called the commutative property of addition. If you have multiplication, this is the commutative property of multiplication. They're very creative with their names there. But yeah, all you got to remember for commutative is that you can flip the numbers around and you're going to get the same answer. Now, one last thing before we take a look at the next property. For it to be the commutative property of addition or multiplication has to be the only operation that is occurring. So I could say 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals 4 plus 3 plus 5. That works. I have more than one addition sign, but all that's happening here is addition. So it still satisfies the commutative property. Same thing with multiplication. If I have 6 times 2 times 3, that's going to be the same thing as 3 times 6 times 2. All I'm doing there is multiplication. Alright, now let's look at the associative property. In the associative property, you'll see that we have groups of numbers. Here I have a group of 2 plus 3, and a group over here of 3 plus 4. And the associative property of addition states that it doesn't matter how you group up your numbers, you will get the same answer. So if I go this way, 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 plus 4 is 9. Over here, it's 3 plus 4 is 7, and 7 plus 2 is 9. So you get the exact same answer regardless of how you group them. For multiplication, it's the same idea. 3 times parentheses 2 times 4 is going to get me the exact same product as 3 times 2 in parentheses times 4. So the associative property says that the sum or the product is going to be the same as long as they are real numbers and regardless of how the numbers are grouped. Okay, and we have one more property to talk about, which is the distributive property. Now, at this point, if you're in Algebra 2, you've used the distributive property before. You should be familiar with it. The distributive property comes into play when, let's say, we have 5 times parentheses x plus 2, and we're trying to multiply this out. So we multiply the 5 times the x and the 5 times the 2, and we get 5x plus 10. Now, the distributive property we're talking about here is really dealing with when you have multiplication and addition at the same time. And all we're saying is, like we see here, this 5 times the sum of x and 2, or whatever is here, is going to be equivalent to the multiplications. But our book shows it more like this. It would be 5 times x plus 2 is going to be equal to 5 times x and 5 times 2. Notice that all we did was break up the grouping here and create 2 sets of multiplication. That is what happens with the distributive property, and it doesn't have to happen only twice. If we were to have, let's say, 5 times x plus 2 minus, let's go with y, this would distribute into 5 times x plus 5 times 2 minus 5 times y. So the distributive property will work for any amount of terms inside the parentheses, and we can even have subtraction in there, and it will distribute out just fine. Alright, and that's pretty much it to what this section deals with on properties of real numbers. We had a lot of different properties. We had the additive and multiplicative identity and inverse properties. Then we had the closure property, the commutative property, the associative property, and the distributive property. Hopefully this made some sense for you, and good luck with your homework.